I was 38 years old. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon. The house was quiet. I was holding two pieces of mail that had just arrived together. In my left hand was the final payoff statement from my mortgage lender. I had inherited some money, scraped together every spare dollar from my salary, and finally killed the 30-year loan 2 decades early. I was holding the piece of paper that proved I finally owned my house free and clear. In my right hand was the new county tax assessment letter. It was demanding $6,800 by January 1st. That number had doubled since the day I moved in. That was the moment I realized this was not bad luck. This was math. My name is Mark, and I spend way too much time obsessing over the hidden costs of homeownership that nobody warns you about. If you are someone who feels like the finish line keeps moving further away every time you get close to paying off your house, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out, because today, I am not talking about mortgage rates or how to save money on your electric bill. I want to talk about the permanent rent you will pay to the government until the day you die, even after you own your home outright. And I know it because I have been exactly where you are standing right now. I am a mid-level logistics manager. I earn roughly $85,000 a year. My entire job is about tracking costs and preventing leaks in supply chains. But for years, I was completely blind to the biggest financial leak in my own life. I played by the rules. I saved a 20% down payment. I bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood. I thought the ultimate goal of the American dream was housing security. The promise was simple: buy a house, pay it off, and live essentially for free in your retirement. I used to believe that paying off the mortgage meant I had officially won the game. Then I sat at that kitchen table and actually looked at the history of my payments. When I first bought the house, my annual property tax bill was $3,200. It felt manageable. The bank rolled it into my monthly escrow payment. I never even saw the money leave my account. It was invisible. But every few years, my monthly mortgage payment would quietly go up. The bank would send a letter explaining there was an escrow shortage. My property taxes had increased, so my monthly payment had to increase to cover it. I just shrugged and paid it. I used to think that rising property values only had an upside for the homeowner. I watched the estimated value of my house climb on real estate websites and felt like a financial genius. Then I found a 2022 report from the National Taxpayers Union. It showed that property taxes are the single largest tax burden for the average American household. For many middle-class retirees, property taxes completely surpass federal income tax. I had to read that sentence twice. People who had not worked in 10 years, people living on fixed incomes, were paying more in property taxes than they ever paid in income tax during their highest earning years. I looked back down at the $6,800 bill in my right hand. Divided by 12, I was effectively renting my own home back from the county for $566 a month, and I would have to pay that rent forever. If I lived in this house for another 30 years, even if taxes never went up another penny, I would pay over $200,000 just to keep the home I already owned. But I knew they would go up. They always go up. I thought I was just dealing with normal inflation. I had no idea I was trapped in a financial loop that would eventually force me to buy my house twice. I did not have a name for it back then. When I finally went looking, I found out it was called the assessed value trap. I did not know it had a name until I started really digging into this. One night, sitting in the dark glow of my laptop, I came across a 2010 working paper from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I had been frantically searching for an explanation as to why my tax bill kept climbing. The paper detailed the history of the modern property tax system. It explained how the system was mathematically engineered to scale indefinitely alongside housing prices. The tax is completely detached from a homeowner's actual ability to pay. It blew my mind. I realized I was not participating in a static transaction. I had signed up for a variable rate wealth tax. To understand how the trap works, I have to take you back to my first 5 years in the house. I bought the place for $250,000. At the time, I was making roughly $60,000 a year. I did the math on my mortgage meticulously. I locked in a fixed interest rate. I knew exactly what my principal and interest payments would be for the next 30 years. I budgeted perfectly for that fixed number. What I failed to understand was that only part of my payment was actually fixed. I used to think that property taxes were a small, stable fee that barely impacted a monthly budget over time. Then I found a 2023 analysis by a major real estate data firm showing that the average property tax on a single-family home in the United States had reached almost $4,000, with many states averaging closer to $10,000 a year. I read that and realized my initial $3,200 bill was not a permanent fixture. It was just a starting line. The first layer of the assessed value trap is the taxation of unrealized gains. 3 years after I bought my house, the neighborhood got hot. A new coffee shop opened down the street. Homes started selling for more money. My house was suddenly appraised at $300,000. I was thrilled. I actually invited a few friends over for a barbecue to celebrate my new net worth. But I did not have $50,000 new dollars in my checking account. I could not take that $50,000 to the grocery store. The wealth was entirely invisible. It existed only on paper. The county government, however, did not care that the money was on paper. They taxed me as if I had suddenly received a $50,000 cash bonus. My property tax bill jumped from $3,200 to almost $3,900. I had to pay $700 real, hard-earned dollars out of my logistics manager's salary to cover a phantom gain. I was paying real cash for wealth I could not touch. I just absorbed the cost. I picked up a few extra weekend shifts, adjusted my monthly budget, and paid the bill. I thought this was just the normal price of my house going up in value. But what I was experiencing was just the surface level of the math. Because paying higher taxes on a more valuable home makes a twisted kind of sense at first. But when I kept digging, I realized the baseline tax increase was not the real danger. The real danger is how local governments quietly manipulate the math behind your back. But when I dug deeper, I found something that most people never notice. I had been paying all my attention to the assessed value of my house. I had completely ignored the other half of the math. Your property tax bill is determined by multiplying the value of your home by the local tax rate, often called a millage rate. I thought the rate was a fixed law of physics. I assumed it stayed the same forever. I was wrong. In year 7 of owning my home, the housing market finally cooled off. The economy slowed down. Home prices in my neighborhood stopped climbing. My house was assessed at $350,000 for the 3rd year in a row. I breathed a sigh of relief. I figured my tax bill would finally stay flat. Then the January letter arrived. My assessed value was exactly the same, but my tax bill had jumped from $4,480 to $4,900. I was furious. I called the county assessor office. A very tired clerk explained that while my home value had not changed, the city council had voted to increase the millage rate from 1.28% to 1.4% to cover a budget shortfall. That was when I realized the game was entirely rigged against me. I used to think that if a housing bubble burst, or if my home value went down, my property taxes would drop and give me some financial relief. Then I found a 2020 analysis by the Urban Institute looking at state and local tax revenues. It showed that in the years immediately following the 2008 housing market crash, property tax collections actually continued to grow nationwide, increasing by billions of dollars even while middle-class wealth was being wiped out. I stared at that data for a long time. When home prices drop and governments face a revenue shortfall, they do not tighten their belts. They just hike the baseline tax rate. They get you when the market is hot by taxing the higher value. They get you when the market is cold by raising the percentage. This is reassessment creep. It is the silent killer of middle-class budgets. You get to vote on local bonds for schools and libraries, which sounds great. But every time one of those passes, a tiny fraction of a percent gets added to your permanent tax burden. Over 10 years, those tiny fractions compound into massive liabilities. Let us look at my real numbers again. Over a 7-year period, my salary had gone from $60,000 to roughly $68,000. That was a 13% increase in gross income. But my property taxes had gone from $3,200 to $4,900. That was a 53% increase in my housing liability. My taxes were growing 4 times faster than my paycheck. And remember, my mortgage payment itself had not changed a single penny. The principal and interest were fixed. I had done everything the financial gurus told me to do. I had bought a house I could comfortably afford. But the comfortable margin I had carefully calculated in year 1 had been completely eaten alive by year 7. I was working 45 hours a week at the logistics company just to tread water. I was trapped in a financial vice. One jaw of the vice was inflation eating my grocery budget. The other jaw was the county eating my housing budget. And the truly terrifying part was that I was still in my 30s. I still had an income. I still had the ability to work overtime to cover the rising costs. And this is the part that took me years to figure out. The part nobody tells you about what happens when the paychecks finally stop. And this is the part that took me years to figure out. The part nobody tells you about when they hand you the keys to your new house. I used to think that seniors who owned their homes free and clear were financially bulletproof. I thought that once the mortgage was gone, your housing costs dropped to near zero, leaving you free to travel and enjoy your golden years. Then I found a study from the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College. It looked at why older Americans were leaving their longtime family homes. The data showed that a massive percentage of retirees were not downsizing by choice. They were being quietly forced out by local governments because they could no longer afford the property taxes on fixed incomes. I read that and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. As a logistics manager, my entire brain is wired to project numbers forward. So one Saturday morning, I opened a blank spreadsheet. I decided to run my property tax math all the way out to my 65th birthday. I knew my property taxes had been growing by an average of about 4% a year between the rising home values and the creeping millage rates. 4% does not sound like a lot. It sounds like standard inflation. But 4% compounding over 3 decades is a financial monster. I typed my current annual tax bill into the first cell. $4,900. I multiplied it by 4% year over year for the next 27 years until I hit age 65. When I hit enter and looked at the final number, I actually pushed my chair back from the table. By the time I reached retirement age, my projected annual property tax bill would be $14,100. That meant the day I stopped working, the day my paycheck permanently vanished, I would owe the county $1,175 every single month. Just for the right to continue sleeping in the house, I had already spent 30 years paying off. And that was just year 1 of retirement. If I lived in that house until I was 85 years old, that tax bill would keep compounding. By age 80, the math said I would be paying over $25,000 a year in property taxes. How was I supposed to pay $25,000 a year when I was not working? Social Security was not going to cover that. My standard retirement withdrawals would be entirely eaten alive just keeping a roof over my head. This is the hidden cost. This is layer 3 of the assessed value trap. When you are young and working, your income usually grows alongside your property taxes. You get promotions, you change jobs, you can absorb the creeping costs, but in retirement, your income goes flat. You are living on a fixed pile of money. But your property taxes do not care that you are retired. They do not care that your income is fixed. They scale infinitely. They act like a vacuum cleaner permanently attached to your retirement accounts. You are forced to withdraw larger and larger amounts of money from your life savings every year just to feed the local tax assessor. And because you are withdrawing more money, you are depleting your retirement faster than you planned. I sat there staring at the spreadsheet. I realized that the phrase, owning your home free and clear, is a complete myth. You never actually own it. You just transition from renting from the bank to renting from the government. The bank eventually stops charging you. The government never does. If you miss a few mortgage payments, the bank forecloses. If you miss a few tax payments, the county auctions off your home and evicts you. The end result is exactly the same. I realized I was meticulously funding a retirement account that was destined to be handed straight over to the city council. But the hardest pill to swallow was not just the retirement projection. It was looking at the total cost over a lifetime. When I calculated the total dollars I was going to hand over to the government over my entire life in that house, I realized I had made the most expensive mathematical error of my life. I sat at my kitchen table and built 2 columns on my screen. I wanted to see the exact difference between the financial path I thought I was on and the path I was actually walking. Column A was the fantasy I had been sold by society. Column B was the mathematical reality of the assessed value trap. I started with column A. I typed in my original purchase price of $250,000. I added the mortgage interest I would pay over a standard 30-year loan. That came out to roughly $175,000. Total cost to the bank was $425,000. Then I calculated what I thought my property taxes would be. When I bought the house, I assumed my taxes would stay relatively flat at $3,200 a year. 30 years of that flat rate equals $96,000. In my fantasy, my total lifetime cost to own the home for 3 decades was roughly $521,000. I thought that was the finish line. Then I moved to column B. The reality. The cost to the bank was exactly the same. $425,000. But the tax math was completely different. I factored in the 4% annual growth rate I was actually experiencing. I ran the compounding numbers over the exact same 30-year period. The total property tax bill was not $96,000. It was roughly $180,000. But then I realized something worse. You do not sell the house the day you pay off the mortgage. The whole point of buying a house is to live in it during retirement, so I extended the spreadsheet to cover a 50-year timeline. 30 years of working and paying the mortgage, followed by 20 years of living on a fixed income in retirement. In column A, 50 years of flat property taxes equaled $160,000. In column B, 50 years of compounding property taxes equaled over $480,000. I stared at that final number until my eyes hurt, almost $500,000 just in taxes. Over a 50-year timeline, I was going to pay the local government roughly double the original purchase price of the house itself. I was literally buying my house twice. First, I bought it from the bank using my physical labor during my working years. Then, I was going to have to buy it again from the county using my finite retirement savings. I looked back and forth between column A and column B. Column A was what the real estate agent sold me. Column B was what the government actually delivered. Every single financial guru on television tells you that a paid-off house is the ultimate security blanket, but none of them show you the 50-year tax projection. The gap between my fantasy and reality was massive. The creeping taxes were going to drain over $320,000 extra out of my net worth over my lifetime. I ran the opportunity cost. If I had known that up front, and if I had invested that difference into a basic index fund earning an 8% annual return, the compounding interest would have generated over $1.2 million in extra wealth by the time I passed away. Instead, that wealth was slowly being siphoned away, month by month, year by year. The day you burn your mortgage, you throw a party. You think you are free, but year 31 is when the real bleeding starts. Because by year 31, your monthly tax bill is often higher than your original mortgage payment used to be. I felt a crushing weight settle on my chest. The entire system is built on this invisible compounding math. But what made me the most angry was not just the numbers. It was the realization of how they got me to play along. That was when I finally understood why I kept getting stuck even when I knew the right answer. That was when I finally understood why I kept getting stuck even when I knew the right answer. I realized I was a willing participant in my own financial draining, and the reason was entirely psychological. The system is brilliantly designed to make you feel like you are winning right up until the moment you go broke. I used to open my real estate apps every Sunday morning. I would check the estimated value of my house like it was a stock portfolio. Every time the number went up by $10,000, I got a rush of dopamine. I felt like a financial genius. I thought I was building massive generational wealth just by sleeping in my own bed. That is the illusion of equity. It is a psychological trap that the entire housing industry relies on. I remember standing in my driveway one Saturday afternoon talking to my neighbor Dave. Dave was ecstatic. He had just checked the recent sales in our neighborhood. He slapped me on the shoulder and said his house was officially worth $400,000. He told me we were making money in our sleep. We both stood there feeling like real estate moguls, but we were not making a single penny. We were just inflating our future tax liabilities. Dave actually felt so rich that he went to the bank and took out a home equity line of credit to buy a new truck. He borrowed against the paper wealth he thought he had. But a few months later, the county reassessed our neighborhood. They saw the same soaring home values Dave had been bragging about. When the new tax bills arrived, Dave was furious. His property taxes jumped by over $800 a year. He was now paying interest to the bank on the truck he bought with his equity and paying higher taxes to the government for the privilege of having that equity in the first place. His monthly cash flow was completely destroyed. The genius of the assessed value trap is how it weaponizes your own pride against you. When the county sends you a new tax assessment, it feels like a report card. Your house is worth more. You feel proud of your investment. And that pride is exactly what the local government relies on, to keep you quiet while they raise your permanent carrying costs. If you complain about your property taxes going up, people look at you like you are crazy. They say you should be grateful your house is appreciating. You are socially conditioned to celebrate the exact metric that is bleeding your monthly budget dry. You are trained to look at your net worth instead of your cash flow. You feel rich on paper, but you are poor in cash. I realized the local government was playing a massive psychological game. They frame the tax increase as a reflection of your personal success. They make you feel like you are part of an exclusive club of wealthy homeowners. But the admission fee to that club is a permanent, ever-expanding drain on your actual take-home pay. I was cheering for my own future tax burden. I was actively rooting for the destruction of my retirement plan, all because I liked seeing a bigger number on a real estate website. Once I saw the psychology behind the trap, I wanted to fix it. But when I tried to explain this to people, I immediately hit a massive wall of resistance. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now, because it used to form in mine. Let me say out loud the objection that is forming in your head right now, because it used to form in mine. When someone first pointed out this trap to me, my immediate reaction was defensive. I told myself that property taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. I believed that if I complained about my tax bill, I was basically stealing from my local community. I thought my money was directly paving the roads, keeping the streetlights on, and paying the salaries of the teachers and firefighters in my town. I wanted good schools. I wanted safe neighborhoods. I pushed back against this idea for years because I wanted to be a good citizen. But then I actually sat down and read my local county budget. And I compared it to the historical data. I found a 2019 report by a financial watchdog group called Truth in Accounting. They analyzed municipal spending across the 50 largest cities in the United States. The data revealed something that completely shattered my noble view of local taxes. In a massive number of municipalities, government spending was growing at more than double the rate of inflation and population growth combined. I looked at my own town. Our population had only grown by 2% over the last decade, but the city budget had expanded by over 40%. Where was my money actually going? It was not going to the classrooms. The teachers in my district were still buying their own dry erase markers. It was not going to the roads. The pothole at the end of my street had been there since I moved in. The money was disappearing into massive administrative bloat. It was covering decades of mismanaged municipal pension liabilities. It was paying the interest on bonds the city had taken out for projects that went wildly over budget. I realized my soaring tax bill was not a reflection of improved city services. It was the cost of local government inefficiency being passed directly onto my shoulders. This is the counterintuitive truth about property taxes that separates the wealthy from the middle class. The middle class views the assessed value on their tax bill as an unquestionable law. They assume the government did the math correctly and fairly. The wealthy view that same assessment as an opening negotiation. Local governments do not calculate exactly what they need for basic services and then stop taxing you. They look at the rising real estate market, calculate the absolute maximum they can extract without causing a political revolt, and then they figure out how to spend the windfall. I realized that blindly paying whatever number they printed on that January letter was not an act of civic duty. It was financial surrender. I was letting a stranger with a spreadsheet dictate my retirement timeline. I knew I could not stop paying taxes entirely. That is illegal, and you will lose your home. But I realized I did not have to accept their inflated version of what my home was worth. I decided to stop being a passive source of revenue. Once I understood that the county assessment was just an opening offer, I changed my entire approach. I stopped treating the local government like an unquestionable authority. As a logistics manager, I know how to audit a bill. So I decided to audit my house. The first thing I did was appeal my property tax assessment. I had always assumed this required a lawyer. I thought it was a complicated legal process reserved for massive commercial real estate developers. But I found out that any homeowner can do it. And it usually costs nothing but a tiny filing fee. I went to the county tax assessor website and downloaded my official property record card. This is the document the county uses to justify your tax bill. I printed it out and read through every single line. Within 10 minutes, I found a glaring mistake. The county had my house listed as having 2 full bathrooms and a finished basement, but my house only has 1.5 bathrooms, and my basement is bare concrete. I was paying taxes on imaginary luxury features that did not exist. Then I spent an hour on a real estate website. I looked for houses in my exact neighborhood with my exact square footage that had sold in the last 6 months. I found 3 houses nearly identical to mine. They were all assessed at roughly $315,000, but my house, with the phantom bathroom and the imaginary finished basement, was assessed at $350,000. I gathered my evidence. I took photos of my unfinished basement and my half bathroom. I printed the public records of the 3 comparable homes. I filled out a simple 1-page form from the county website and submitted my appeal. 2 months later, I got a letter in the mail. I had won. The county legally lowered my assessed value from $350,000 down to $315,000. Let me show you the real math of what that one afternoon of work actually produced. At my local tax rate of 1.4%, my annual tax bill dropped from $4,900 to $4,410. I saved roughly $490 a year. That sounds like a small victory. But remember, this is a game of compounding math over decades. By resetting my baseline assessment lower, I stopped the compounding effect on that extra $35,000 of phantom value. I opened my spreadsheet again and ran the new numbers. If I took that $490 in savings every year and put it into an index fund, earning an 8% annual return, over the next 30 years, that single afternoon of filing an appeal would generate almost $60,000 in wealth for my retirement. $60,000, created from a few printed photos and a 1-page form. I realized I had just taken back a massive piece of my financial future from the local government. I felt a sense of control I had not felt since the day I signed the original mortgage. But appealing the assessment was only a temporary fix. It only reset the starting line. I knew the county would eventually try to raise the value again. I knew the millage rate would eventually creep up. I needed a permanent system to shield myself from the creeping taxes over the long term. The second step I took changed the trajectory of my entire retirement. The second step I took was building what I call a perpetual tax shielding fund. I realized I could not stop the local government from raising my taxes over the next 30 years. But I could build a financial engine that grew faster than their tax hikes. I opened a standard brokerage account. I committed to putting $200 a month into a broad market index fund. I also took the $490 I saved from my tax appeal and automatically deposited it into that same account every single year. I treated this account like a second, invisible mortgage. But this mortgage was paying me instead of the bank. Let me show you the math on how this shields your retirement. Historically, a broad market index fund returns around 8% a year on average. My property taxes were growing at roughly 4% a year. By investing that $200 a month, plus my annual appeal savings, I was building a pile of capital that compounded twice as fast as my tax liability. I ran the numbers out over 20 years. By the time I hit age 58, that dedicated account would hold over $130,000. At an 8% annual return, that account alone would generate over $10,000 a year in passive growth. That growth would completely cover my projected property tax bill at that age. I would never have to pull a single penny from my regular retirement accounts or my Social Security checks to pay the county. The shielding fund would pay the permanent rent for me. I had effectively neutralized the assessed value trap. I was using the math of the stock market to defeat the math of the local tax assessor. When I sat back down at my kitchen table a few months later, I looked at that county tax bill again. But this time, I did not feel the blind panic I felt on that first Tuesday afternoon. I felt prepared. I had drawn a line in the sand. I had appealed their imaginary numbers, and I had built a fortress around my monthly cash flow. The third thing I changed was my fundamental mindset about real estate. I stopped looking at my primary residence as a massive investment. A house that you sleep in is not a wealth-generating asset. It is a highly taxed consumption item. The equity is a phantom. The taxes are cold, hard cash. Once I accepted that reality, the quiet background stress of homeownership finally disappeared. I stopped checking my home value online every Sunday morning. I stopped caring what my neighbor sold his house for. I stopped cheering for my own financial destruction. I finally understood the core truth. You never actually pay off your house. You just pay off the bank. The government will always be your permanent landlord. And the only way to survive a landlord who can infinitely raise your rent is to own cash-producing assets that grow faster than their greed. If this video helped you see your finances differently, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe. Every video I make is something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.